Welcome to the Beer Taster's Notebook, the show dedicated to learning about beer. I'm Jonathan Thompson, advanced cicerone, beer judge, home brewer, and beer writer. Welcome back to the Beer Taster's Notebook, episode 4, IPA. So IPAs, or India Pale Ale, they've gained a lot of popularity lately, obviously for probably some pretty good reasons. And, you know, over the centuries, it's had its heydays and its naydays. Today is a heyday, of course. You know, I mean, right now, I think you'd have a really hard time finding a brewery, at least in North America, that doesn't make at least one. In most cases, more than one. And in some cases, almost nothing but. I mean, they'd be really hard to miss, too, right? I mean, in a blind lineup, they'll just stand out loud and proud. It may be an inter-IPA discrimination test. It might pose a bit of a challenge. You know, is it a West Coast or a Northwest Coast or something like that? But versus a bunch of other beers, I mean, they're going to be unmistakable. It is a broad category, unlike, say, Weiss beer, where the inputs and process are dictated, the yeast is specified, and, you know, that must be served in a Weizen glass by a man in leather pants between the ages of 32 and 56, sporting one of 3 regulation haircuts. Okay, that's silly, but you get the idea. So IPAs for sure have guidelines, but, I mean, you're not going to come up with a Black Belgian IPA by sticking to your knitting. So the key features of IPAs, of course, are a really big nose of hops and a big mouthful of bitterness. In North America, we do tend to bifurcate between the two major ones, the West Coast, which is that clear, piney, resiny, citrusy, sort of dry, bitter, and then the original IPA, and then the East Coast. And by the way, when I say original, I mean original in North America, of course, not in the world. The East Coast IPAs are also called Hazy IPA, Juicy IPA, New England IPA, or simply any IPA. They are hazy, as you may have deduced, usually less bitter, and the nose is more tropical and stone fruit than it is forest floor. That doesn't mean it has to be, though. There's nothing really to say that, you know, you can't have a East Coast IPA that has Cascade, which is sort of the classic American hop in it. And there's nothing really to say that you can't have a West Coast that you've dry hopped with a bunch of sort of tropical noted hops. So the English IPA, of course, is the original. It is less hop forward, more balanced, and the aroma is more marmalade with some minty woody hops. I want to say maybe a bit of earthiness to it. I also note that the East Coast IPAs are very popular amongst consumers, but they are the subject of rampant malignment from beer experts. So I've heard chicken soup, orange juice, you know, all kinds of descriptors. And I also like to note that these aren't coming from, you know, sort of armchair experts either. I mean, some of the top people on the planet, as far as beer is concerned, they harbor this like major disdain for the East Coast IPA. I judged in a competition recently, and when I mentioned to my judging partner on a different category that I had judged the East Coast IPAs the day before, he thanked me for my service. No joke. And so, anyways, we'll talk about some of the subvariants later as well. But for now, let's dive into how this delicious elixir came to be. So let's talk about the story of India Pale Ale. It's more of one of evolution than design. And so there's also kind of a myth out there that a man named George Hodgson invented it. This is not the case, but it also has now spawned the sort of the anti-myth that he's not involved at all and he's just useless. So neither of those are actually true, but let's begin. And so most of the time when you read about IPAs, they start in East London, but we're not going to start there. So let's start about 210 kilometers, so that's 130 miles for my British and American friends, north to the town of Burton-on-Trent or Burton-upon-Trent, depending on your leanings. So this town had a rich brewing history dating back to around the 11th century. The monks at Burton Abbey were brewing. By the 1300s, it was becoming recognized for the really high-quality beer. And then by the mid-1600s, beer from Burton was being found pretty much everywhere in England that it could get to. So the first real commercial brewing there was founded around 1708 by Benjamin Printon, and then others followed along, notably Worthington's in 1744. And then by 1780, there were about 13 commercial breweries in Burton. So Burton water is high in calcium sulfate, which is also called gypsum. Of course, at the time, they had no idea. They just knew that the water made good beer. Water chemistry wasn't a thing. Remember, they don't even know what yeast is at the time. I mean, they don't really know what it is. But why this is important is kind of multifold. So the mash pH is very important. And a higher pH can facilitate the extraction of silicates and polyphenols, which leads to a really harsh and astringent beer, kind of like a wine that hasn't had time to open up, or like some oversteeped tea. So the calcium ions help to reduce the pH and therefore reduce that potential extraction. Calcium is also essential for yeast health, and so it aids in a more complete fermentation, meaning that you get better attenuation and sort of a less sweet beer. It also helps out with protein coagulation, so that can drop out of suspension and then you get a clearer beer. Sulfate ions can enhance the perception of hop bitterness. This is very important, obviously, for bitter styles of beer. They also lend a little slight sulfury whiff to the beer, which is lovingly known as the Burton Snatch. Oh, I also wanted to tell you that going for a Burton was a term that was used by the RAF for someone whose plane had been shot at enough to pretty much eliminate the chances of them continuing to live. So now you have a little ammunition for your next cocktail party. So I'd also like to note that as famous as this water is and was, there's similar water profiles existed in Tadcaster, which is in Yorkshire, Edinburgh, and Stratford-upon-Avon, which of course is the birthplace of one William Shakespeare. So a few developments in the British beer world really kind of helped to start solidifying what we're going to eventually find as an IPA. So Coke was introduced in the 1600s. Coke in this instance being, not a sparkling, dark, sweet beverage, nor the source of Pablo Escobar's fortune. It's a coal-based fuel. It's really, really high in carbon, lower in water than other volatiles. So it burns cleaner. It's basically made almost in the same process as charcoal. So mid-century, it started being used in kilns, especially for malt, and that sort of drove the advent of these paler malts. A paler malt, surprise, makes paler beers, but they're also less smoky and have better extraction, being higher in enzymes and just higher in fermentables. So all of this coincides with the increasing commercialization of brewing. And the same with pretty much everywhere else up to this point. Like, it's still really a domestic endeavor. And of course, consumption is rampant. Most texts on English beer at this time are going to mention that everyone drank beer because it was safer than water. This is a consistent theme across the entire world of beer at this time. And the reasoning because the beer is boiled. I mean, I bring this up all the time. I still don't understand why they just boil the water. I mean, you go in the backwoods canoeing and you scoop some water out of a lake and you boil it and drink it. And I mean, I do it all the time and I seem to still be here. I mean, I guess I have some idea why they didn't boil the water. I think you know what that is too. Anyways, another thing to note is that the brewing season here was from October to around March or April, which you might recognize some similarities with another brewing-rich area, which we just recently discussed. So the beers brewed later on in the season are hopped more heavily as a preservative quality. So they did recognize that hops had some preservative characteristics. So then around 1675, pale ale sort of comes into the picture as a viable and desired style. So, of course, now, we recently saw how the British development of pale malt dramatically influenced or maybe catalyzed several continental styles that really dominate the planet today. And at this time, pale ales are brewed and consumed mostly in the north and in the Midlands. And then the amber ales and brown ales are still dominating the south of England. The October beers of these days are highly hopped, brewed to about 19 to 25 degrees Plato, and then dry hopped and matured. So it does seem like they ended up around 8 to 12% ABV. And October beer was sort of a stronger pale ale. So then in 1698, the Trent Canal Act makes shipping to the ports of Hull possible. And this really opens up the market for Russia, Baltic, and to some degree the East Indies. Although most of the beer arriving in India was from London, the Mersey Canal opens in 1777 from Burton to Liverpool, and that opens another market. The 1700s also saw the Industrial Revolution taking shape. So this means expansion, increased exports. Things like steam engines, hydrometers, thermometers start appearing in breweries and driving more consistent end products. It also helps to sort of push pale ales further south. And by the early 1700s, pale ales are being sold in London. By 1717, most London brewers, who are generally porter brewers, were also brewing something pale as well. And sort of at this time, by the way, mild meant fresh, and stock or stale ales meant beer that was brewed much stronger with the design of sort of being aged. That's just something to keep in mind as we go through the story. So I mean, beer at this time is being shipped mostly to America, but also to the East and West Indies, and as far as Australia. It also had a home on ships, as sailors were rationed about 4 liters a day. That's about 4 quarts, so it's about a gallon. And sort of using the same argument that, beer is safer than water. I guess in this case, I have to semi-agree. During the reign of Peter the Great, which ran from 1682 to 1725, although technically he co-ruled with his brother until 1696, English beer was quite popular in Russia. And the main export of beer was a dark brown, sweet, strong, probably like a predecessor to barley wine. And all this is pretty important because Burton-on-Trent didn't have a big enough population to drink all the beer they're making. So Bass, Alsop, and Worthingtons, which were the 3 of the bigger brewers there, were making these exports. And then in 1766, Catherine the Great agrees to allow the import of even more English beer. So let's take a couple of minutes to think about beer on a ship. So, first off, it's in a wooden barrel. And this means that both oxygen, Brettanomyces are going to get in there. So it's going to taste pretty interesting, period. The trip to India is around 6 to 8 months. The trip to Russia is going to be weeks to months, at least. So first of all, that's an insanely long time for beer to be maturing, especially in wood. Secondly, there's no physical stability, right? So it's constantly sloshing around. So any protection from a layer of carbon dioxide is being perpetually perturbed, and oxygen is just there, just doing its thing. And oxygen, it chews stuff up, man. So don't forget the temperature fluctuations either. So now, they have no knowledge of microbiology at all. And so they don't really know what's going on, but they did happen to know that hops seem to provide some preservative qualities, and stronger beer would hold up in general. And so this would have been the same case even shipping up to Russia, right? It's not a short trip, even though it's way shorter than going all the way around and down and back up to India. So at this time, back to just focusing on India here, since I guess that's what we need to focus on. The trade there is dominated by the East India Company. Everyone knows, or I shouldn't say everyone, but I assume that most people have at least heard of them. And they had this monopoly, right? I mean, the trade from India was almost unidirectional. So these officers would take these trips around, and then they'd load up on all kinds of fancy things like spices and silks or whatever, and then they'd bring them all back. And of course, there's no point in showing up with an empty ship. So they had the idea, we can bring the comforts of home to the colonies. I'm sure we all can agree that nothing provides more comfort than delicious beer. And so the East India Company was headquartered in East London, around where the rivers Lee and Thames meet. And then just up the river, just a paltry 3 kilometers, was the Bow Brewery, founded in 1752 by George Hodson. They brewed both porter, as everybody did, and October beer, as many people did. And he happened to have a very fortunate location. So not only is he extremely close to the East India Company, but he's also able to have excellent Herefordshire malts sent down the River Lee from Ware. So now there's actually a bunch of other brewers who are just as close to the East India Company, but Hodgson had a bit of an edge here. So he extended credit to the officers of 12 to 18 months. So basically this means you can take a shipment of beer, put it on a ship, sail around to India, sell it, then come back and pay for it. He also pretty much undercut everyone else as well. So, I mean, he really does dominate that market at first. Now, just a little, so the history of his brewery gets a little bit murky in most texts. So just to clarify, I'm just going to insert a little timeline here. So it's founded, as I mentioned, in 1752. In the late 1700s, and there's no idea when any of these people were born or died. There's no records of any of this, that at least that I can find, and there's nothing in any of the literature. But in the late 1700s, his son Mark gets involved, and then at some point in time, George dies. Mark dies in 1810. The brewery goes into trust, and then in 1819, Mark's son Frederick takes over, and then there's a bunch of name changes. So in 1820, it changes to Hodgson and Drain. Then in 1838 to Hodgson and Abbott, and then in 1849 Edwin Abbott and Son, and then in 1863 the Bow Brewery Company, and then in 1869 Smith Garrett and Company. So we're going to just try and refer to it as Hodgson's from now on, because otherwise it's just going to get insane. So just back to the story here. So Abbott and W.A. Brown's Imperial Brewery are also shipping beers to India, but far less than Hodgson. And all these beers are porters, October beers, or stock ales, by the way. There's a fair amount of information that indicates that the stronger, paler beers had a higher survival rate than the porters, and then became obviously the favorites for export. I mean, I think this is consistent with everything that we know about beer today anyways. Hodgson is still primarily a porter brewer, just by the way. But a clever little trick that they came up with was they would ship the beers immature. So immature means that it's only around a year old, which it's still nuts. But anyways, so the idea is it ages on the ship, and then it's sort of at its peak upon delivery. His beer would have been brewed fairly dark and murky, by the way, and it would have cleared out on the ship. So he shipped these porters to India as well, right up and through until the 1840s. Let's just talk about London water for a second. So it's really high in calcium carbonate, and remember we discussed Burton water a little earlier. So this means that it's what we call hard water. So it also makes the water more alkaline, which means that the pH of the mash is going to be higher. So the acidity of darker malts will help to neutralize this, which is why it's more suited for things like porter or stouts. The higher pH also leads, it does lead, as we said, to the unwanted extractions of certain materials, polyphenols specifically, and also some silicates. But a higher pH also hinders some enzymatic activity, which of course is bad because we need those enzymes to break down sugars into more fermentables so we can get, better beer. This also means that the pale ales that they're sending over, I guess they're still October beers, are probably not nearly as pale as we would like them to be in our imaginations. So back to the situation in Burton. In 1783, Russia, in I guess what seems to be an attempt to either boost domestic brewing or just general protectionism, imposes a 300% tariff on British beer. That might sound mildly familiar to people today. So a side note here is that in 1698, a beard tax was implemented in Russia. That's beard with a D at the end. Basically, they tried to get rid of beards so they could fit more in with, Western Europe. Police were actually allowed to shave you in public if you didn't pay. And if you had paid, you had to walk around with a beard token to prove that your beard was, legit. Just trying to paint a picture of some of the rules that are coming into place right around these times. So anyways, the Burton brewers, they kind of have a problem now, right? Because that's ludicrous. I mean, you're not going to be able to ship to your main market. So Poland and Prussia, which is of course now Germany, became new targets for export. And then in 1800, trade with Russia just completely ceased. 6 years later, the Napoleonic Wars start, and access to the Baltic Sea is just basically gone. Even when these wars all end, they try to start things up with Russia again, but the tariffs just keep coming back into play, and then there's all these different activities start sort of hindering that the restarting of any relationship. So some beer is still being shipped and sold domestically, but it's really like a drop in the pail compared to what these exports used to be. So now production is dropped at all these breweries because they have to figure out what to do with all this beer they're making. So Hodgson is still dominating the trade into India, but the brewery at this point is being run by Mark Hodgson, the son, and he's starting to pull some sketchy moves. So they keep changing the credit terms and heavily manipulating prices. Unfortunately, everyone still kind of prefers their beer. And also around this time, competition in shipping was increasing, which kind of depressed the East India Company's long-hold monopoly. In 1819, Mark Hodgson's son, Frederick, so the grandson of George Hodgson, takes over. And then in 1920, the British government passes the free trade laws, and that just really further opens up the market to everybody. Also, at this time, he teams up with his partner, and the brewery, as I mentioned, is now called Hodgson and Drain, but we'll continue to refer to it as Hodgson. So these guys at Hodgson decide that a really excellent idea for their relationship is to start their own import and shipping company. Clearly, this does not amuse the East India Company. So Allsop right now is the prominent brewer up in Burton. And so the East India Company decides we need to pay these guys a visit. So the guy who they meet with is named Campbell Marchbanks. It's spelled Marjorie Banks, Marjoribanks. So ruminate on that for a while. Anyways, so he serves them some samples of Hodgson's ales and asks Allsop to try and replicate this. So they try, and it's not good. So then they try again, and by sometime around 1823, they're producing and shipping it. But the feedback is still pretty unfortunate. They continue to hone it, and they realize that if they even use a paler malt, it becomes much better. Bass and Salt, who are the two other major Burton brewers, also start producing pale ales for the India market. And so now all four of them are competing for the same market. Hodgson continues with their shenanigans, flooding the market, manipulating prices and such, but their beer is becoming fairly inconsistent and the shine is sort of dulling. So Hodgson tries to take control of the entire supply chain, cut out the East India Company, and they've just now at this point, they've just had enough of these guys. And so they just officially switched to Allsop. So this is now 1826, and Allsop's recipe has pretty much been massaged to perfection. The Burton brewers have also discovered that their water chemistry does give them a massive advantage when it comes to brewing these pale ales. So, I mean, technically, Hodgson's pale ale is still considered the best of them all up until around 1829. And also around this time, there's some references to chilling beer with saltpeter. So this kind of indicates that it wasn't chilled before. Now, I find this interesting. And of course, now I'm going to have to go and spend hours and hours digging through all kinds of timelines about temperature and beer, but, riveting topic, I'm sure, so stay tuned. But the warmer a beer is, as we know, the more active the volatiles will be. So imagine you don't know what yeast is, you don't know what microbes are, for that matter, and you're brewing beer and then put in wood barrels and subject to violent mechanical and temperature manipulation, and then it's served unchilled. And of course, it's full of Brett character too, right? I mean, that's got to be a wild ride. Okay, anyways, I'm getting too excited. So let's move on here. So in 1830, a news article mentions that Hodgson's ale is inconsistent and Allsop's is not. Okay, cool. At this time, Hodgson still refers to their beers as pale ale, by the way. Note that no one's calling these India pale ales yet. We still haven't even got to the name. So in 1817 and then in 1822, there were some ads specifying pale ale prepared for the East India and West India climate, and pale ale expressly brewed for the Indian market, respectively. But according to Mitch Steele in his book IPA, in 1828, the Bengal Hakaru mentions a new beer, India Pale Ale. But once again, I mean, so maybe there's mention of an India Pale Ale or Pale Ale for India, but no one's calling their beer that. Finally, in 1835, an ad appears for Hodgson's India Pale Ale. And then in 1837, a beer merchant put out an ad using the same name, India Pale Ale. Interestingly, this merchant was actually taken over by Edwin Abbott, who then eventually is going to take over from Hodgson. Anyways, but we're getting way ahead of ourselves here. So in 1840, India Pale Ale is the official name of the style. But so also was East India Ale and Indian Pale Ale. But I mean, I didn't want to lose momentum on the name, so we're just going to have to step back a little bit here. So 1832, Bass has taken the lead, and by 1837 was shipping a lot of its beer to India, and 60% of that was IPA. So newer breweries are having a hell of a time competing with them. And in fact, Worthington's just decides that they're just going to concentrate on bottles. And actually, their White Shield IPA still survives. It's still around. Anyways, so Hodgson's nefarious practices live on, and they continue to fall out of favor. Just never mind this inconsistent beer. It's just they're just not playing good cricket, right? So they respond to this by shipping elsewhere, of course. But now there's some sour grape situation starting to creep up with all kinds of counterfeit products out there, which is even worse tasting, and that's just tainting their name even more. So I mean, Hodgson's just on a steady decline at this point. So, right through the 1840s, Bass just continues to dominate. And then the Australian gold rush takes hold, and it starts shipping almost as much beer to Australia as it was to India. In 1839, yeah, I know I stepped back a tiny bit, but the Derby-Birmingham Railway is finished. So this route runs 68 kilometers from Derby in the East Midlands to Birmingham in the West Midlands. This probably doesn't seem very exciting by today's standards, but one of the stations along the route is Burton-on-Trent. And so that is pretty exciting because this railway also connects to the North Midland Railway when it's completed. And that adds another 116 kilometers to the network. And then more importantly, it connects to the London and Birmingham Railway. You've probably noticed that the names of these lines are just purely descriptive. So you can obviously guess the terminals of each line, but this network connects Burton-on-Trent with the City of London. So this blows the domestic market wide open for the Burton brewers. And somehow they managed to have a better marketing program than Hodgson, and they further pushed them down into sort of non-existence. And so in the 1840s, Hodgson sold to Abbott, then went bankrupt in 1862, was bought and sold a few more times, and then it was finally actually demolished in 1933. So that's it for Hodgson, by the way, and that's why I just jumped ahead in time and then back. I do try and keep this as linear as I possibly can. So the 1850s to the 1880s was really the era for IPA in Great Britain. So the railway expansion continues to broaden the domestic market, and now demand is outpacing supply. So the breweries have to expand. Burton-on-Trent's becoming a major brewing center, and Hodgson's basically out of the way. So Salt, Allsop, and Bass, they now own the market. Now, in the late 1860s, Allsop and Bass had 70% of the market share, and Salt was kind of left in the dust. And at this time, Burton hosted 26 different breweries. And also around this time, water chemistry started to become somewhat understood. And this led to the possibility of replication elsewhere. So, national beer consumption was also increasing. Mild ales had supplanted porters for the working class, and IPA became the urban upper class beverage. Mostly because the inputs and aging drive the costs up, and also not hurting the cause, of course, where there are all these toutings that beer is a healthy beverage, and in some cases IPA was claimed as medicinal, which I would very much like to believe. Anyway, so other non-Burton brewers started making IPAs. The main competition was really Edinburgh. So Edinburgh has a long brewing history, but the first pale ale of the region was brewed by a man named Robert Disher of the Edinburgh and Leith Brewery. They'd been shipping to India for a while, and they actually have a general history of exports anyways. Others followed suit, including McEwen's and Younger, two names which should be familiar to most beer people. The town of Alloa, northwest of Edinburgh, actually has the same water profile, and so it was rapidly becoming a brewing center as well. It even was referred to as the Burton of the North. Glasgow, by contrast, has very soft water. Just as a little FYI there. So the Auld Alliance saw Scottish beer being exported to the Netherlands, France, and actually as far as New Zealand and the West Indies. And by 1890, pretty much a third of British exported beer was coming from Scotland. And so although the water in Edinburgh and in Alloa are similar to Burton, the pale ales were not. So Scottish brewers boil for longer, and they used some amber and roasted malts. So it was obviously less pale. They also mashed hotter, and so that means that you get fewer fermentables, and they also fermented cooler. So also something to note is hops don't grow in Scotland, and so bringing them up from hop growing regions further south is obviously costly, and so to keep these costs under control, the hop charges were much lower. So moving overseas for a bit, brewing had been taking place in the United States basically since the early days, and these practices were, of course, based on English techniques. The brewing took place mostly in the Northeast, but they still imported a lot of beer. These brewers, they mostly made ales, and a lot of it was stock ale and other strong pale ales. So they decided maybe they'd try some Burton ales. American brewers had, of course, zero aversion to adjuncts, and they were also flush with 6-row malt, so you kind of need adjuncts in there, right? So they started tossing some sugar in there. The sort of the premier IPA became Ballantyne's IPA. There were some other brewers around. The Christian Fagerspahn brewery in New Jersey contained what they called a monk cellar with 100-barrel oak vats for aging IPAs. Their beer was described as for sipping, whatever that means. It sounds interesting. Vassar's, Consumer Brewing, and Frank Jones Brewery were also popular. C.H. Evans brewed English styles with 100% American ingredients, and it turned out that where they were brewing near the Hudson Valley, the water was not unsimilar to Burton. They incidentally peaked in 1910, brewing more than 70,000 barrels. And then meanwhile in Canada, the two big brewers, so Molson and Labatt's, each brewed an IPA at one point. That sort of faded away. And then Alexander Keith's brewery in Nova Scotia was founded in 1820 by a Scotsman by the name of Alexander Keith. They became famous for their IPA. Incidentally, it survives to this day. It's really low in everything, like everything, right? So it's low IBUs, low ABV, I dare to say low flavor, but it's still around nonetheless. It's fairly well marketed as well. And I should also mention that, IPAs to a degree were actually brewed in India as well at this time, mostly in the foothills of the Himalayas. Obviously, it's going to be pretty hot towards the south. So back over in England, a slew of regulatory changes start taking shape. There's accusations of unsavory additions to beers that starts driving quality control. Various installations and retractions of certain taxes start to change the world of beers in general, but especially IPAs. And then the major change is the Free Mash Tun Act of 1880. It's more accurately called the Inland Revenue Act. But prior to this, the malt itself was taxed, and brewers were kind of restricted in their use of ingredients. The act now taxed the brewers on the original gravity of the beer. So this is a bit of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, now you're permitted to use adjuncts in unmalted grains, so corn, sugar, rice, all fair game. Pretty cool. But not so cool, because now instead of being taxed on what's going in, you're being taxed on what's coming out, well, before it goes and gets fermented, right? So brewing a strong beer is now massively inconvenient and a little more costly. So just a fun bit of trivia, the Isle of Man had installed the Isle of Man Pure Beer Act, also known as the Manx Pure Beer Act, in 1874. So it's kind of rather Reinheitsgebotian in a way. It restricts brewing to water, malt, sugar, and hops. It doesn't mention yeast, like nothing else ever seems to. So the Free Mash Tun Act doesn't actually supplant this because the Isle of Man holds legal autonomy. So as an aside, also the Isle of Man hosts two official languages, one of them being English and the other being Manx, the sister language to Scots, Gaelic, and Irish. The island also has only one crematorium. This law still stands, by the way, the pure law. Okay, so the rising popularity of continental lagers and pilsners wasn't really helping either. And so the demand for lower gravity IPAs is sort of pushing the Burton ales backstage. I will say this is kind of their own fault because it was the British who taught Anton Dreyer and Gabriel Sedlmayr all about pale malt. And then they went back and they brewed those pale beers, and then that sort of became the most popular thing. And then that incidentally spawned, Bohemian Pilsner, and they all came full circle back, and then pushed them out of the market. So, Anyways, so several of the Burton brewers decided that to start brewing lagers. That didn't really work. And now, IPA was, as I mentioned, very popular in London, of course. And remember, it's like sort of the grandchild of these October beers, which were like the upper crust drink. Because wine wasn't really the hoity-toity drink of the upper class British at the time. They apparently refused to drink French wine during the wars with the French, which must have been a bit inconvenient, considering there were like 31 conflicts from like 1100 to 1800, including 200 years wars. So brewers in London, of course, can't ignore the local market, so they start trying to make IPA themselves. Well, as we mentioned, London water is very soft, so the beer is not really nearly as crisp. They also boil it really hard, and so the beer is darker. Fermentation's a bit faster, so it's going to have different fermentation characteristics. So it's just a different beer. Now, despite the legality of sugar as an adjunct, the Burton brewers still held off and were all malt. In fact, they were until after World War II, but the London brewers did not hold off. So then back in America, it's now the 1890s and consolidations have started. The economic downturn sees lower consumption in Scotland as well. And so many breweries start consolidating there, and then they consolidate again and again and again. IPA basically dies in Scotland until Dietsch's revives it towards the end of the century. And Burton is still suffering. The attempts at the lager business are just not panning out. Some of the advice about, staying in your lane might have been handy, but Alsop tries merging with Salt in 1907. This fails. And then in 1911, they go bankrupt and eventually merge with Ind Coop. Salt actually went into receivership right after the merger failed, like almost immediately, and then Bass took them over eventually in 1927. It's amazing that these things take so long, but anyways. So through temperance movements, wars, the sudden decision that being hammered in public is not a good thing, the Burton IPA is pretty much dead. And the style is really fading in the U.S. as well, but, Prohibition hits, and then the final nail is just driven into the coffin. And post-Prohibition really saw no resurrection. So now we're like at the point where the style is basically dead around the globe. And frankly, beer in North America is basically in a coma. In England, not much is going on either. All these lower gravity beers are holding court. And there's not a lot of excitement, as well as like the industrialization of beer everywhere is really kind of compressing any kind of flavor. So these are kind of the dark ages of beer, I like to continue to call them and everything. And so let's just fast forward now. So it's now 1965, and the Anchor Brewery in San Francisco is throwing in the towel. So a man named Fritz Maytag, and from the Maytag Appliances, decides he's going to buy it and try and get it turned around. And he does. He takes a trip over to England in the early 1700s, the 1970s, to learn some techniques. And then he was kind of disappointed, frankly. So the experience seems to have left him somewhat dejected, but he comes back. Nevertheless, he starts working on a pale ale. He's influenced by Ballantine's, and they call this Liberty Ale as an homage to Paul Revere. And in 1975, it's released. So it's not particularly well received. Most of the criticism is really directed at the bitterness. So he goes back to the drawing board. And this time they use all malt. So they picked up the liberal use of sugar in England, and they decided maybe they would discard this practice and go back to all malt. Another really important decision here is they decided to throw a new hop variety in there called Cascade. It's resiny, it's piney, and it's citrusy. And quite frankly, Cascade now defines American hop character. So this beer was still 40 IBUs, which is high for the time, and it was released as a Christmas ale. It continues to be released every year until 1984, actually. I'd like it to note that it was not called IPA. So in 1981, Ken Grossman of Sierra Nevada released Celebration Ale. And Ken had been brewing for years and was a real explorer of hop varieties. And so when he found Cascade, he kind of took a shine to it as well. And so the Celebration Ale was made. It was hopped with Cascade. And incidentally, he was also influenced by Ballantine's. I can't really find anything to pinpoint this, but I guess I could ask someone, but some sources claim that it's the same yeast as Ballantine's that Sierra Nevada was using. But again, let's note that this is not named IPA. So the honor of sort of necromancing the name goes to Bert Grant, who in 1983 released Grant's IPA, which was, by the way, 50 to 60 IBUs. So the 1990s is when we really see craft brewing take off in America. And new hop varieties are providing much appreciated boost to all of this interest. Cascade, Centennial, Chinook, and Columbus, lovingly known, of course, as the sea hops, they really make the foundations for this homegrown bitterness. And, why stop there, right? So pretty much every craft brewery is now trying to make some kind of an American IPA, and the arms race to the hop bomb is on. Bitterness increases across the board. The famous lupulin shift, as it's called, starts to take hold. Double, imperial, triple IPAs start showing up. Charging the beers with hop extracts becomes a new thing. Variations start appearing later on. We've got Belgian IPAs, white IPAs, brown IPAs, red IPAs, black IPAs, rye IPAs, session IPAs. I'll go on and on, but I'm starting to get dizzy. And so, of course, then we start splitting East versus West as well with these advent of these sort of hazy, juicy IPAs. So, let's just talk about maybe some of the beers themselves. I think we still have some time here before everyone gets super bored. So IPAs have something in common. Pale ale malt is the backbone. Heavy hopping obviously is key, dry hopping in most cases, and usually clean yeast. Some IPAs use a little bit of caramel or Munich malt or something, and a lot of them, though, are 100% pale malt. New England IPAs often have the addition of oats and wheat, giving it that haze, and doubles and triples often employ the use of sugar, as would be somewhat necessary to get those high ABVs. And so on top of the big three, let's just call them, West Coast, East Coast, and English IPA, let's go through some of the other varieties. So Belgian IPA is a pretty interesting one. It's kind of like a Belgian triple that's been IPA-ified. And, as we all know, Belgian ales tend to be very phenolic and very estery, or both. And so while maybe a shotgun approach to hopping a clean beer might not be a sound practice, the results are unlikely to be really devastating. But in the case of Belgian IPAs, care is beyond important. So if this is poorly planned, it could be one of the worst beers you'll ever have. And I'm being serious about that. It could be just awful. But there are some very good ones. I've recently had a Dufel triple hop cashmere. It's a stellar example of this beer. It's unbelievable. I wish I had another one. In fact, I'm going to go get some when I'm done this. Anyways, brewed IPAs, another style. They're a champagne-ified IPA. I know I'm making up words here, but whatever. So it's super fermented with the addition of enzymes, usually like amyloglucosidase, to fully dry it out. Sometimes corn or rice flakes are added in as well. So they're super effervescent. Like think about like a IPA that's like really, really clean and really dry with like really, really tiny little bubbles. They can be quite nice. Double IPA is kind of what it sounds like. Nothing in the beer world is really double or triple anything, except maybe the fun. But it's definitely more of everything. It's more alcohol, more bitterness, and more hops. Triples are just even more. And good examples of these are rare. So if you are down with drinking a glass of gasoline, go and buy all the triples you want. I'm slightly biased, obviously, but I do continue to hunt for the elusive, delicious triple. So I'll buy any new triple that comes out and I'll try it, and I reserve judgment. And if it's good, I'll talk about it. If it's not good, I just won't bother because I don't see the point of that. So I like to group these as what I call the color IPAs, which is kind of a stupid way of doing it, but it's fine. So a white IPA, we're going to start there because it's kind of the differentiator. A white IPA is basically like a Belgian fit beer crossed with an IPA. You can almost, you can say that it's an IPA that's been brewed as a fit beer or vice versa. And so done well, they can be really, really refreshing. I've never really had one that's been bad. I've had some that have been kind of lacked in character, so they've been just meh, but none of them have been terrible. A red IPA is like a more bitter and more hoppy amber or red ale. A brown IPA can be described as a more bitter and hoppy brown ale or a more malty and dark IPA. You can choose. Just think about an American brown ale that's just more aggressive in the hops. Black IPA, which is also called Cascadian Ale, is like a roasty dark IPA, but it's really tricky because if you push it slightly in the wrong direction, you end up risking it being a porter or a stout. They're also all really, really hard to find. You know what? A good description is almost like it's like a really hoppy Schwarzbier that's got a slightly less clean fermentation profile than a lager, but it's got that same kind of roasty quality without being, acrid or burnt. Cold IPA is an IPA that's been lagered, and so the fermentation is clean, and a lot of the secondary products have been cleaned up. So this is probably actually a good introduction to IPAs for people who are new to them, as far as drinking, not learning, but just trying to get accustomed to the bitterness and to the flavors. And it also definitely could be a platform for hop aroma because there's nothing really else in there that's competing with it, right? Because we've pushed out any of the other secondary flavors and aromas. New Zealand IPAs are just IPAs that get hopped with all those wonderful and crazy New Zealand aromas. Gooseberry, kiwi, white grape, passion fruit, melon, tropical, and of course the famous cat pee. Rye IPAs have, of course, rye in the grain bill. This adds a bit of a rye, peppery spiciness to it, and it also gives it slightly creamier body. They're pretty good. They're also really hard to find. In fact, yeah, they're just hard to find. So session IPAs are just that. They're smaller. There are some good ones out there, but a lot of them taste watered down. Brett IPAs are funky and barnyardy. If you're not familiar with Brett character, they can be kind of off-putting. We'll get into Brett down the road. It's just too special to just tuck into any other episodes. Sour IPAs, well, they're sour. Milkshake IPAs seem to have gone back to the yard. It's more like a dessert, right? It's like a liquid trifle. It's a bit bitter. Are they good? I don't know. It's kind of a trick question. I don't know. Some of them are good. Some of them are not good. How's that? Just go and find out for yourself if you can even find them because they're pretty rare now. And so that basically wraps up most of it. I just like to say, I think IPAs are important for two reasons. First of all, they're delicious, and that should probably be reason enough. But really, the world of hops and hop aromas is vast and expanding. And it's just so fascinating that a beer that can showcase these aromas and that can showcase new aromas really should be held in the highest regard, even just from a sensory standpoint. Anyways, that's really all I have to say on IPAs for today. Thank you for listening, and stay thirsty and stay curious.